Thank you, Paul. There you go. This morning, my Partners in Flight Western Working Group colleague, Edwin Juarez, and I are very happy to welcome you to this international session, where we ask you not only to look southward, but to look northward for lessons learned in species recovery and co-production. First, I'd like to acknowledge that I am talking to you from the traditional territories of the Semiahmoo, Coast Salish, Katsi, Tsawwassen, Stolo, and Kwantlen peoples. And for the rest of you, that's southwestern BC. Edwin and I wanted to showcase you the outstanding work of three scientists who are going to show you how they take support and research from their home geographies, countries of origin, and exploded into co-production of science and applied research. Together, they have over 75 years of experience in full life cycle research and applied conservation. And I'd also like to give a shout out to Klamath Bird Observatory, who have also been influential in much of this work. So we'll start in Canada, where we have similar endangered species legislation and we adopted it 30 years after the US, and still, despite having only half the bird species, more land and less people than California, we've listed more birds as endangered and threatened, and even a few more special concerns. On the Canadian Species at Risk list, we have many road to recovery species, including Ken's special evening grosbeak and the poster bird for Partners in Flight. Canada has the bulk of the breeding range for over half of the road to recovery birds. And so while, despite our detailed process, we've knocked very few birds off our species at risk list like the US. And while Canada is still focused on single species research and assessment, we've completely realigned the implementation of species recovery with a new investment of over $1.4 billion focused on species and spaces. This may not seem a lot in American terms, but it's game-changing for Canada and the Canadian Wildlife Service. So our new investment includes many themes that are linked to the international agreements that we signed together with our Latin American countries. And so in this international session, you will see from our speakers how much of our international species recovery and research is linked to the well-being of people and their ecosystems. Through our talks, you'll see how investing in the well-being of these communities, the biodiversity and ecosystems, we not only help birds, but we're building resiliency, not dependency, and long-lasting sustainable recovery of bird populations. So it's with a great honor that I introduce our first speaker from Canada. It's Dr. Christine Bishop. She's a research scientist with the federal government in Environment and Climate Change Canada. She's also an adjunct professor with Simon Fraser University of British Columbia and Thompsons River University. Her research examines the effects of multiple stressors on the wildlife populations, including environmental contaminants, habitat fragmentation and restoration, and road mortality. Since '85, she's been very active in research and conservation activism in the Great Lakes and in BC with local, regional, Indigenous, and international collaborators. She's speaking on bird conservation today, but she has been working on frogs and reptiles and riparian habitats since the 1990s. So Christine has initiated research and grassroots actions with ranchers, Indigenous bands, American and Mexican partners, and has led to the recovery of the Western yellow-breasted chat. And she's going to speak to us today on this. Thank you, Christine.
Thanks so much, Wendy, and hello from Canada. And the featured species here is the yellow-breasted chat, and even though I really like evening grosbeaks, which are also yellow, this is a species that the American Ornithological Society assigned its own family. It's the only species in this family, the Pteriidae, in 2017, because it is so unusual. So I think there's a lot of cool species we're talking about today, but the yellow-breasted chat definitely ranks right up there. So what I want to talk about today is actually some good news about an endangered population in Canada at the northern limit of its range. And this is the view of the Okanagan Valley, and it's one of the most rapidly developing areas in Canada. It's got lakes in it, but it's also very arid. It's a very south part of Canada, so obviously very popular in a place where there's a lot of cold temperatures for a good part of the year. And this population is in a very restricted riparian zone in this valley. And of course, the yellow-breasted chat isn't just occurring in British Columbia, and our study area is in this area here, but it actually occurs in other parts of Canada as well. There's considered a not at risk population in the two provinces next door, although there haven't been any serious monitoring there for over 20 years. The eastern subspecies is actually listed as endangered over here in Ontario. And in the western part of its range, this is Washington State, just south of British Columbia, the riparian zone is highly endangered where the species occurs. And in the Willamette Valley in Oregon, which is south of Washington, the species is listed as conservation concern, and also a species listed as special concern in California because there is so much pressure on the shoreline habitats where the species prefers. So what we started with in the Okanagan Valley was 25 pairs breeding there in 2001. And now, as of 2019, we had 250 pairs breeding there. And we just did surveys in 2021, and hot off the press, we have 40 new territories on top of that 254. And what's exciting also from a research and a recovery point of view is that back in 2016, we identified sites that were the low elevation habitat in riparian zones that we predicted the chats could occupy if the population expanded. And in this year, all of those sites are being occupied. So the question is, how was this accomplished? Because when I say riparian habitat, this is a species that likes mid-successional habitat. In our particular area, they definitely nest in wild rose, but that's not necessarily true throughout its range, but they nest in thick understory. And some of that understory can actually include huge mats of poison ivy. And this is a kind of forest that not everybody sees the value in. It's not a climax forest that most people can relate to. So the success came from working both in the northern part of the range and the southern part of the range with a lot of different partners in a lot of different walks of life. And this is a yellow-breasted chat wearing a geolocator. And the first part of my talk will be focusing on our northern partners, and that involves a number of Indigenous bands. The Inalkin Center, which is the Environmental and Healing Center for the Penticton Indian Band, working with the Suyas Indian Band, and then also the Lower Similkameen Band, who didn't work directly with us as a partner, although we helped fund the work that they did. They were working on their own, but developing riparian habitat restoration in the valley just next door to the Okanagan, where the species occurs in those two different valleys in British Columbia, and the only place that it had been breeding. So we also worked with the South Okanagan Similkameen Conservation Program, which involves a variety of partners in the valley. One of our key partners within that conservation program has been the Nature Trust of BC, working with BC ranchers to develop a program to protect riparian areas. And then in the southern area of the range, these are our partners down in Western Mexico, primarily San Pancho Bird Observatory, also Tierra de Aves, and the University of Guadalajara. And just a shout out here to working with our collaborators and having access to actually meet people. And at NAOC Vancouver 2012, the Luis Morales right here. And he was an intern with the Klamath Bird Observatory. And he attended that conference, and I was able to meet him through connection with John Alexander, who's director of Klamath Bird Observatory. And through that internship program, Luis was able to help start the San Pancho Bird Observatory. But I also just wanted to say that I was inspired by the Partners in Flight meeting at that conference to develop more of a program outside of Canada. And also, even though the pandemic's been a negative in a lot of ways, creating these hybrid meetings where there can be more collaboration, even for people who can't attend in person, I think is going to really help conservation. Certainly meeting up face-to-face at this meeting was really helpful to me and our partners. So just to give you a whirlwind view of what's happened over the last 20 years, what we worked with is in the Okanagan River, and there's been a lot of impacts on the riparian zone there through diking. We conducted a lot of research, which I'll mention, and this was designed in a before and after control impact examination of what we knew, what we did, and whether or not it made a difference. It made a big difference in terms of identifying critical habitat for this species. We identified a number of threats to the species, including roadkill. And as I said, we developed a partnership. And I just want to make a few comments about the future. So the work that the Nature Trust did was to work with Environment Canada to provide funding to protect riparian habitat. And the appeal here for the ranchers was not only protecting habitat, but also protecting water quality in the river. And then the work that we did with the Penticton Indian Band along this river was to do some very innovative work where they're actually creating sites where they're breaching the dike that was beneficial to Chinook and sockeye salmon, but also developing planting programs involving band members to create terrestrial habitat around those areas that were being enhanced. I won't go into all the research that we did, but we did a lot of it, and it involved collaboration with Simon Fraser University, University of British Columbia. I just wanted to mention the potential impacts between Canada and Western Mexico in terms of the sort of things that the birds have to deal with, not only the usual threats, but climate change, where wind conditions are changing during migration, looking at the survivorship of the species, highly influenced by severe weather events. But on the upside, up here in Canada, the growing degree days actually is increasing and may actually have some positive effects for the birds. Our recent PhD student, Kristen Mancuso, conducted work not only in yellow-breasted chat, but another riparian species, gray catbird. And she also worked with Klamath Bird Observatory and also down in Chiapas, Veracruz, and Nayarit. And she identified migration corridors. And the interesting thing is that the even at the periphery of its range, this bird is flying the same migration corridors and overwintering the same areas as birds that were geolocated from Oregon. Some of the important things that she identified was that here are some GPS results for birds that were tagged, but they're actually spending relatively little time in protected areas. So it's something we need to think about in terms of conservation. And finally, the question is, will there be a long-term chat population here at the northern limit of its range? They use that mid-successional habitat. It's under threat for development, but there's also a need to maintain a mosaic of protected habitats because mid-succession will eventually become climax forest if that area is even persisting because of climate change. This is a very arid valley. If these areas start to change into a grassland, we may lose the birds entirely if they don't have a place to move up at a higher elevation. And finally, the future involves working with the Lower Similkameen Band and new PhD student, Sky and Louie, who's going to look at the social, cultural, and song stories in Indigenous lands from Canada to Mexico, and connecting elders and youth, not just through research, but also through the cultural relevance of this species throughout its range. Thanks very much for your time.